Welcome to IAYTD and welcome to What is Wednesday. Today we're covering Lord of the Rings and by extension, The Hobbit. You're getting a 2-for-1 deal. This video is for people generally unfamiliar with these properties, not the hardcore fans. So let's start at the beginning. In 1937, author J.R.R. Tolkien published a children's story called The Hobbit. It featured a race of creatures called hobbits, sometimes referred to as halflings, as they're quite shorter than the average man. They also have hair-covered feet, a fondness for drinking, smoking, and eating, and live in a peaceful corner of this fictional world called the Shire, in tiny, quote-unquote, hobbit holes. The Hobbit begins when a wizard named Gandalf shows up at the door of Bilbo Baggins and convinces the Hobbit to embark on an adventure across the land known as Middle-earth. He doesn't travel alone, though. He travels with 13 dwarves. 13 is an unlucky number, hence the addition of Bilbo. They go on an adventure that only spans one book, but plenty of action set pieces including a fight with dangerous spiders, hungry trolls, and plenty of underground orcs. Now speaking of orcs, while these monsters are fairly common now in franchises like Warhammer, Dungeons & Dragons, Warcraft, it's really Tolkien's works that defined how we now see them. It was a term before Tolkien. He didn't create the term orc, but he was the first to characterize them as man-like, aggressive goblins, basically. Even the term orc was interchangeable with goblin at that time and throughout his novels. Now back to the adventure. Long story short, Bilbo ends up encountering a creature called Gollum in a cave, and he stumbles upon Gollum's most prized possession, a simple golden ring. When the Hobbit puts this ring on, he becomes invisible. Because The Hobbit was intended to be a children's story, that's really the extent of the ring's powers at that time. In the original publication, Gollum willingly bets his ring in a game of riddles. But after Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings and fleshed out the effects of the ring, he went back and rewrote that chapter to reflect the ring's corruptive powers, instead having Gollum mourn the loss of his precious. We'll talk about the ring more in a second. The end of The Hobbit finds the dwarves and Bilbo facing off against a giant talking dragon named Smaug, who has taken up residence in a former dwarven stronghold. The dwarves want their treasure back, and they end up enlisting the aid of nearby humans, elves, and eagles to defeat not only Smaug, but also an attacking horde of orcs. Bilbo returns to his quiet life in the Shire and begins to write his adventures down in a book called There and Back Again. Now after he published The Hobbit, it immediately became a huge success. Tolkien began working on a sequel immediately, called The Lord of the Rings. But he found himself creating an entire world around the fiction that he had already created. He spent time creating entire languages for the elves and dwarves and other races. See, Tolkien had much experience in linguistics, even having worked for the Oxford Dictionary for a time. He was thought to have spoken about 20 languages at a basic level, most of them European and Scandinavian in origin. He even coined the term native tongue to describe the language or languages that are learned during a critical developmental age for people. It's this passion for language that led him to creating these new languages and cultures that surrounded them. Now, as I said, The Hobbit was a huge success, and he was spending a lot of time creating Lord of the Rings, which became a trilogy of books and became a much larger adventure than his first novel. It was also much darker in tone and expanded greatly upon the ring and what it could do. The Lord of the Rings creates a whole mythology for this world that The Hobbit only showed us a glimpse of. We learn about the origin of multiple rings beyond just the one that we've seen. It turns out there were 19 rings made, 3 for elves, 7 for dwarves, and 9 for men, each to be worn by the leaders of their people. A nefarious being named Sauron secretly made another ring, which is meant to control and enslave the others. This doesn't work out exactly as planned because the elves don't wear their rings and the dwarves don't fall under his control, but the 9 kings of men, they are absolutely taken over. Sauron, with the corrupted men and the armies of orcs, attempts to destroy all good in the world basically, but a few good heroes manage to stop him by cutting the ring right off. Long story short, the ring ends up lost for a long time, and is eventually found by a hobbit, who eventually becomes the creature Gollum. And that's where it connects to The Hobbit, see? This ring was something more than Bilbo knew. So when Lord of the Rings begins, we learn that this ring is something very powerful, and Sauron, who now exists as a spirit trying to crawl its way back into the physical realm, wants it back. To find it, he sends his 9 human kings out to find the ring. These beings, now called ring wraiths, eventually find the ring in the Shire, where Bilbo has given the ring to his nephew Frodo, and he has ventured off to live with his elf friends in retirement. Now, similar to the structure of The Hobbit, this triggers a huge epic adventure. As opposed to a group of dwarves and 1 hobbit, we're now following 9 people known as the Fellowship of the Ring, they must travel to a place called Mount Doom, where this one ring was created and they must throw it back into that fire. In this fellowship, we've got some other hobbits, some friends of Frodo. We have a dwarf, an elf, 2 human warriors, and Gandalf the wizard. They encounter some massive battles, some great monsters, and some political intrigue that they must find a way to survive. The fellowship gets disassembled, some people don't make it, and we meet a whole massive array of supporting characters that weave their way in and out of our story. Throughout the story, though, the focus is really on Frodo and the ring. It begins to corrupt him, taking him down the same path that Gollum took. He's faced with the challenge of trying to destroy the ring that he so desperately loves now. It's a tale of desperation and addiction and willpower. It manages to span 3 books because of these supporting storylines that complement the main mission. We encounter a ranger who's destined to become king. We encounter living trees who must wage war against an industrialist wizard who seeks to burn them all to the ground. We encounter an insane steward who will destroy the city he's responsible for protecting. There's a lot going on, but at its core, it's about the strength of 2 hobbits, Frodo and his best friend Sam, and if they can vanquish evil forever. The first publication of Lord of the Rings happened in 1954 and took the world by storm. Most critics loved it and became a sweeping sensation. While film wasn't yet able to capture that magic, it came to the world in cartoon form in 1977. Starting with The Hobbit by Rankin Bass. These cartoons captured the same spirit as the books, including poetry and music interlaced throughout. Surprisingly, in 2001, received a live-action adaptation courtesy of director Peter Jackson. Instead of beginning with The Hobbit, though, he instead created 3 films based on The Lord of the Rings, and then went back in 2012 to release 3 films based on The Hobbit. These movies were universally loved, including the 3rd Lord of the Rings film, Return of the King, winning the Academy Award for Best Picture in 2003. While these films included plenty of groundbreaking techniques, the most notable is its execution of performance capture technology, using the actor Andy Serkis to bring Gollum to life. The term motion capture has essentially been erased from the film industry, as just the motion isn't enough anymore. It's all about the performance, the fact that an actor can now appear on screen as something else entirely. The same technology has been used for films like King Kong and the new Planet of the Apes movies, which happen to both star Andy Serkis. The novels and the movies have both been inspiration for countless songs and video games and parodies. Most stereotypes of the fantasy genre have really stemmed from these novels, including typical depictions of elves, dwarves, and orcs. The genre of high fantasy is almost synonymous with Lord of the Rings. Following Tolkien's death in 1973, his son published other novels and stories that his father had written, including something called the Silmarillion, which is basically a chronological telling of the entire history of Middle-earth. Yes, that's something you can buy. And that is the basic gist of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Some info about Tolkien, some info about the books he wrote, and some cultural impacts that we still see today. Make sure to check back here next Wednesday for another What Is video, and thanks for watching.